It's interesting. I never thought about that.
My name is Alan Freedman. I'm a director of the Australian Jewish Association, and sitting next to me is Andrew Tucker, an international lawyer who born in Australia but is now based overseas. But he's co-authored a new book which we're going to talk about. Andrew, welcome back to Australia, and it's lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
The book is titled Israel on Trial: How International Law is Being Misused to Delegitimise the State of Israel. What's the overarching premise of the book?
Well, basically, the book we wrote because we were concerned about the way that international law is operating. And we've seen in the last decade a sort of a whole raft of UN resolutions which are claiming that it's illegal for Jews to be living in East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. Now, we want to question how international law could get to that point, given that 100 years ago a promise was made to the Jewish people to create a Jewish homeland in the heartland of what was known as Palestine. In other words, Judea and Samaria. So how does international law get to the point where things are turned around completely? So the book tells the story of what international law is and how we believe that the UN system has been deliberately mobilized in order to undermine the Jewish state of Israel. So it's a book about international law and about the politics of international law.
So a lot of people accuse Israel of being a colonising enterprise that has stolen someone else's land.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, then I would say do your history, because there's one people more than any other on the face of this earth who have had a deep abiding connection with this land as the Jewish people. The problem is our historical memory often only goes back to 1967, or if you're lucky, 1948. You can only understand this conflict, I think, if you go back 2,000 years, even longer.
Yeah.
It's not a long time, actually, in the scheme of things. So it probably makes sense to sit down and have a bit of a look of what's gone on, and you'll find that from an international law perspective, the Jewish people have got a pretty good claim to this land.
So this goes back to the mandate. So mandatory Palestine was subdivided. How strong a legal case does that become? Because people are obviously challenging that, aren't they?
Yeah. Look, the problem is that international law in itself is a bit of a moving target. So international law has changed enormously over the last 100 years. This makes it difficult. And so it's important that we apply international law today. But when you apply international law, you've got to look back at the way things developed historically. So when 100 years ago, the Mandate for Palestine was created and rights were effectively given to the Jewish people through the means of that mandate, which was a treaty, those agreements, those rights have an ongoing effect. Now, since 1945, we've had the introduction of international human rights law. Didn't exist 100 years ago. Exists today. So we have to accept that. It's important. So the Palestinians have human rights, as do the Jews, by the way. The Palestinians have a right to self-determination. Okay. But that doesn't take away from the rights that already existed.
Yes.
And I think that's the key point.
But when we talk about Palestinians, I think they've done a very good job of convincing the world that they're this ancient indigenous people that have been booted off their land. Yet we see that really the whole Palestinian national cause has really only been, well, really since, 70, 50 years ago. They seem to have done a very good job of convincing the rest of the world of a story that is not necessarily based in fact. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that when the Mandate for Palestine was created, 90% of the population of the Mandate area was non-Jewish. Okay, so you had people living there. The mandate was intended to preserve and protect their rights. The mandate for Palestine was unique in that it gave the right for Jewish people in the diaspora to come home. And that's unique in world history. And I think we're struggling to kind of understand that. And it was only possible because we realised that the Jewish people are going home to a land that they already belonged in, having been kicked out 2,000 years ago by the Romans and so forth. You're right to the extent that, yes, there's been a narrative that the Palestinians are the indigenous people. I don't think, obviously, that's correct. Nevertheless, they're there. There are people. They have rights. We've got to do something with that. This is the huge challenge, and there has to be some kind of solution, but not to the detriment of the existence of the sovereign state, Jewish state of Israel.
Sure. Now, you're in Australia at the time that we're discussing the potential move of our Australian embassy to Jerusalem. Have you been involved in this discussion? Are you being asked to comment about it?
Yes, we are.
Who to?
Well, we've been... yesterday we had a meeting with the number of members of Parliament. There is a Australia-Israel Parliamentary Friendship group, and we spoke to the members of that group. We are in communication with the Prime Minister. We're in communication with other cabinet members. And obviously we're in communication with the Jewish and the Christian communities. So I think we're I hope somebody's listening.
The interesting thing, my observation, is that all of the critics of this move seem to say the one thing: it will be unhelpful. But I've never actually yet heard them explain how it's going to be unhelpful. Now, if West Jerusalem, which is where the embassy is going to go, is and will remain Israeli territory, where, I guess I'm trying to ask you where these critics come from. I mean, what do you say to them?
Well, I think what people tend to be saying is there is a peace process. There's supposed to be negotiations. And part of the negotiations under Oslo is the status of Jerusalem. Okay, there are a number of issues that still need to be negotiated. So they say if you recognise Israel's assertion of sovereignty over Jerusalem, you're somehow interfering with that peace process. Mm-hmm. Now we would say, to the contrary, no. Israel in that process has always asserted sovereignty over Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem, but not only. And placing an embassy in West Jerusalem simply is an affirmation of our support for the democratic Jewish state of Israel. And I think that helps the negotiations, to be honest, because it shows the other side that they are dealing with a sovereign state. I think it would be appropriate to move the embassy at this time. I think it would be a strong signal. I think it's not helpful to talk about West and East Jerusalem. I think that whole issue should be left untouched for different reasons. And if the embassy were to be moved to what is West Jerusalem, I don't see that in any way compromising the rights and interests of anybody else.
Can you see a resolution to this conflict happening anytime soon?
To be honest with you, I don't.
No.
No.
So what happens? Do we just maintain the status quo, which seems to work for Israel? I mean, they're happily building their lives. The Palestinian side of town are busy and very preoccupied in trying to destroy Israel.
Yeah.
So where does all this go?
Look, I think, we're talking about the Middle East. So there are different rules that apply in the Middle East. And we in the West, so I'm speaking as a non-Jew here, we in the West don't understand the dynamics necessarily. Israel and the Jewish people do. They know what it's like, so let them deal with it. That's the first thing I would say. And instead of trying to come up with solutions the whole time, leave it in the hands of those who are party to the conflict. Secondly, I do think it's important that we sit down and have a really good look at this. 25 years since the Oslo agreements, it hasn't got us very far. And I think we ought to sit down with the right people and have a look at what are the issues that are stopping this coming to a resolution. I think recognition of a Palestinian state at the moment would be a very, very undesirable thing, because it would prevent that process, and I think it would be rewarding aggression and terror. There's a complex bundle of issues, and so we've been encouraging the government here in Australia to have a good look at this, set up a process, a review process, get the right people around the table, internationally as well, and think through alternative models for a solution whereby the state of Israel is respected, and the Palestinian people have some degree of autonomy and self-governance, which is fine, but that has to be a process of discussion and negotiation.
Is the underlying block to all of this cultural? So on one side you've got an Arab Middle Eastern culture, which is vastly different to Israel, which is essentially a westernized culture. And are we talking oil and water here?
Maybe, I think for sure, to some extent. Look, to be honest, I think deepest, this is also a religious conflict.
Yes.
You know, why is it that Indonesia jumps up and down, and Malaysia? Why do they not have diplomatic relations with Israel? Why do more than 20 states in the world not even recognise the existence of the state of Israel? There's nothing to do with water or oil, in my view. And I think we've got to realise this. There is a deep conflict at a religious level. It's part of the complex paradigm.
Yes, yeah. That would be the start of a whole new discussion. So on that point, we'll leave it there. Andrew Tucker, thanks for joining us on this little video clip for the Australian Jewish Association. We just love you guys. We think you do a fantastic job, and all power to you. Thanks again.
Good. Thanks for having us, and many blessings to you too.
Thank you.
Yeah.